Well, good evening, everyone, and thank you for inviting me. I hope I can entertain you this evening. I feel a bit of a fraud, really, because you've got some very competent judges in your club who have been judging a lot longer than me. But this talk is not all about judging; it's a bit tongue-in-cheek as well. And obviously, I'll give you a slightly different perspective, I suspect, in addition to any sort of comments that I might make. So, without any more ado, let's crack on with how to maximise your chances of success in photography competitions. Well, I put this slide in because someone asked me, when I've done this talk now quite a few times, and someone asked me this very question. So I thought, well, to prevent that, obviously you know me better than a lot, but not necessarily everyone does around the UK. So just a little bit about me. I've been involved in photography and competitions for about 40 years, got quite a bit of experience now, and I've got some distinctions, but distinctions in terms of the actual letters after your name. I'm sure those of you who have got them will agree with me. They don't actually make you a better photographer. But what does make you a better photographer and makes you more aware is the journey to get them, because you have to put yourself through it to understand the stress and strain of what it is to get those distinctions with other people judging your work. And finally, I used to, many moons ago, teach photography at adult education. Okay. You may or may not agree with this, but I think everyone's got a competitive streak in them. Maybe you wouldn't want to admit it, but I think everyone likes the feeling of getting a successful high score, or even coming first, or dare I say, even being the winner of a competition. It gives you a nice feeling, even if you want to dismiss it, and I'm no different in that respect. So before we start, just a few questions to ask yourselves, and this obviously works a lot better if we're all face-to-face, even though I don't expect anyone to answer the questions, but just food for thought, really, things just to prompt you to give some thought to it. So why do I take photographs? Do I take or do I make photographs? Or in other words, how much of me do I put into my photography? Do I like entering competitions? And if not, why not? How long do I take in preparing an image for a competition? I mean, that's quite an interesting one, because some people dismiss it and say, oh, I just whack them through Lightroom and that's it. Others spend hours in Photoshop. Do I make photographic prints? Do judges not appreciate my work or dismiss it as record photography? How many times have you heard that expression used? With JPEGs and RAW, I'm not going to certainly lecture you on working in Photoshop or in RAW conversion software, but if you do shoot in RAW, you really do have to have a reasonable knowledge of RAW conversion. I find a lot of people who have heard that it's important to shoot in RAW because you gather so much more data, but they haven't really got to grips with subjects like Lightroom and various other RAW conversion software. If you don't want to get involved in that sort of work, then you are better off in shooting in JPEG, where, although it's not perfect, the camera does quite a lot of basic processing for you and will produce a reasonable image that you could enter into a competition. We'll come back to that. So this is just to sort of illustrate that. The image on the top there is straight out of the camera. It's a raw file, and as you can see, it lacks contrast, detail in the fur, and the snow is almost blown out. And on the bottom right is the processed image, just literally processed in Lightroom from the original raw file. And you can see just how much more detail there is in the fur, in the eyes of the snow leopard, and in the snow that it's actually walking through. So just a bit on competitions as well, so we can try and put all this in some sort of context. So to start, I just want to talk about the main competitions. This talk isn't covering the wider gambit of looking at distinctions. We're just looking at competitions and the things that you might encounter in either club or inter-club type competition. So first of all is open. So the most common competitions tend to be open, and that's great in the sense that you can produce your best possible work. You don't have to worry about whether you've taken something out or put something in. You can just put the image in knowing full well that you're not going to trip up over any particular rules. Specific set subjects or titles. Here you do need the rules. You need to study them and appreciate the interpretation and what sort of weighting that subject matter carries, because although you may well just go through your archive and find pictures that you think roughly relates to the subject or the title, quite often if there's a heavy weighting that, it's sometimes better to perhaps go out and photograph quite specifically to meet that set subject. A panel. More and more now I'm finding that clubs are doing competitions for panels, quite often 3 but sometimes 5, that work as a whole, and they combine in both the storytelling and they work as a body of work together. And judges are expected to not only judge the quality, the technical quality of the images, but they're also expected to judge how they work as a panel. And you need to be aware of that as well. And finally, prints. If you're entering into a print competition, then the print quality will have quite a significant impact on the mark you get, together with the paper choice and even the mounting board. How often have you seen people put a really nice image in a really garish, strange coloured mounting board, which kills it absolutely stone dead? So it's quite important that you actually realise and appreciate this in the context of competitions. Just a few more things to finish off before we start looking at images in particular. So in club competitions, there's normally just one judge. Now that does make it easier in some respects, but it also brings in it a degree of subjectivity on the part of the judge. So to try and minimise the impact of the judge's prejudices, you want to try and mix up your entry. What I mean by that is kind of hedging your bets. So you don't know necessarily what the judge's likes and dislikes are, unless you're some of these people that keep a notebook about judges' likes and dislikes and study it before you actually put images into a competition. But we'll pass over that for the moment. So what I'm saying to you is, if you've got 3 very good pictures of a barn owl, don't put all 3 pictures in if 3 is the number you can enter, because you would just be competing with yourself. And if the judge doesn't like barn owls, then you're automatically on the back foot. So it's much better to have a spread of images as best you can come up with. Judges have a lot of images to look at, so they very early on, when they're going through them, have to find reasons to eliminate them. So you get down to the final few that are going to be the ones that are either going to be, if you're looking at first, second and third, and commended and highly commended, or if they're judged in a numeric number, you're looking for the high scorers. And finally, don't be fooled into thinking, oh, it's only a club competition, so it'll be a low standard. It is far from it. When you consider that in a salon, generally speaking, or even in the MPAGB competitions, there are 3 judges, and they will have only a few seconds, half a minute at the very, very most, to make a decision as to what mark they're going to award that image. Whereas with a club competition, the judge invariably has sent the images in advance and therefore has weeks to crawl all over them and put a magnifying glass all over them, and maybe even ask their partner what they think So there's a lot of studying of your images. And judges, I had an image judged the other night. I'm not going to mention the judge, and he said, "Oh, I think you should have taken that cable tie out that's holding down the mouse that the bird had landed on." And I, in all honesty, hadn't noticed it, and I had to blow it up to 300% to see what could have been construed as a cable tie, or it could have been just a bit of the bark. But all I'm pointing out to you is you do have judges that do move away from the normal sort of rule of thumb, is to look at it at a reasonable distance, to blow them up and examine them in the minutest detail. So let's just be clear, there'll always, and you will always have successful images, but they won't necessarily win competitions. Now that doesn't make them bad images by any means. In fact, if the image pleases you and your family, and it's a really beautiful record of a special moment in time, then it's a good picture. It's a successful picture. But this talk isn't about that. This talk is purely about maximizing your chances of trying to get a good score in a competition. But it's worth remembering that quite often when you have these particular pictures that you favor, there's a big difference between what you like and necessarily what the judge likes. And that's not because you've made a poor judgment call, or indeed the judge's part. Judges have to be dispassionate. They weren't there when you took that image, and they don't have the memories associated with those images. So don't be surprised if they don't necessarily have the same feeling towards an image that you do have. And you probably gathered them, and these two images are very near and dear to my heart, but I don't expect a judge to feel that way at all. So what are we going to do this evening to try and improve the chances of success? Well, we're going to examine what judges are looking for in an image. We're going to look at successful images, as you'd expect, and types of photographic genres, which some do better than others. We're going to try and avoid your images being dismissed as record photography. And we're going to look at some techniques that can help to improve your images. And finally, we're going to hopefully help you give the judges a hard time, which is what this talk is really all about, and often avoid what is commonly called judge bait. So we're going to start with landscapes and see some of the qualities that judges are looking for in different types of images. So landscapes, I would suggest, is probably one of the hardest genres to win competitions with. It really has to be of an incredibly high standard to actually get a high mark when it's up against nature, sport, even portraits. So it has to have an incredibly strong composition. It has to have good lead-in lines, good foreground detail. It has to have a good detailed sky, if indeed the sky is in the image. It has to have good balance, good light, and a bit of atmosphere. Sometimes snow or mist really adds to the image. And just put it into sort of the context of how the judge is viewing your image. The foreground should have more contrast than the mid and background. So it creates this recession into the landscape. All these components really have to be included if it's going to stand up as a good landscape. And finally, obviously stating the obvious, the correct exposure. So no burnt out areas in the sky, and no blocked up shadows. So we all know about the times to take images. So dawn and dusk are always a good time to take your image, and you get that, obviously, that much warmer, softer light, which enhances the image. But quite often you can't always be at those places to take those images. So sometimes it is a matter of what you've got. You sometimes have to work with. But even a good sunset doesn't necessarily mean it will work unless it's a good composition as well. This beautiful scene of Luskintyre without the canoeist. And no, I didn't put the canoeist in, believe it or not. We were both thanking the people looking down on us for when this canoe just started paddling out as that sun was going down on Luskintyre Beach. But these are the elements which really help to make the images work and do well in compositions. So here you've got beautiful storm light. I've always loved the light in this image. It's taken in Santorini. You've got the very stormy clouds, but then you've got those lovely crepuscular rays coming down. But it never, ever worked properly. And then I hit on the idea of taking this little sailboat from Cowes in the Isle of Wight and slipping it in to the image. And suddenly it became a successful image. And sometimes it can be as simple as that. On the subject of simplicity, or less is more, try to avoid giving the judge 2 or more pictures. Here's a scene that you've seen many times, and obviously photographed many times. It's a very simple image, but it at least is giving you one image to look at. It's relying upon that tree as the basic point, focal point, and it anchors the scene. And then you've got this nice sky going up with a bit of the reflection below it. But here you've got another, what appears on the surface, a good composition. But is the mountain competing with the church? And would you get a judge say, well, I think there are probably 2 pictures here, one of the church and one of the mountain? And would it be best, therefore, to choose a slightly different angle, maybe put this into a portrait mode, so that you've just got the fence and the church without having an overkill of the mountains? And that's what I mean about simple, or presenting the judge with just one image to look at. Now here, this looks a pretty simple image, 3 trees. But when you start to analyze it, yeah, you've got 3 trees, you've got some beautiful steam coming up, which is backlit by a rising sun. And then you've got this lovely line in the snow, which is taking you through the picture, past the first one, to this one, and then onwards. And it's things like that that tend to strengthen the pictorial quality of the composition. Here you've got another, what I would call simple picture. A few components in it, but the elements come together. So you've got the beautiful macaire grasses, and then you've got this single little figure walking across the beach. Luckily walking in the right direction rather than walking out of the image. And to try and enhance this feel, I've done what certainly the magazines don't necessarily tell you to do, is I've gone for negative clarity in the post-processing, which gives it a much softer feel. But sometimes softer images can be far more effective, particularly when you've got an image like this. I think for far too often now, we've been wanging the clarity slider across to the right in Lightroom or in the raw conversion software in Photoshop, and getting really gritty, high contrast images. And now there's certainly, if the image is right, for a feeling that maybe a softer, more sympathetic image works with the scene. Here, although there is, you could argue there's 2 images here. You've got the sort of frozen waterfalls, and then you've got the mountain beyond. But here, all the elements work to drive your eye through the image, past the waterfalls, and then luckily there's a little bit of light hitting the mountainside, and it kind of draws your eye in and takes your eye up to enhance the composition. And another simple snow image. I'm not obsessed by snow images, but it looks like it at the moment, doesn't it? Where you've got the fence drawing you in, but the final bit that sort of adds to the composition is these deer walking through the image. But for a long time, I kind of tried to think of how I could make those deer come really more prominent in the final part of the composition. So I use what's called dark and light center. Some of you may be aware of Nick software, and in Color Effects Pro, one of the pieces of plugin that you can actually get, one of the settings, is called Dark and Light Center, and it's not really designed for landscape. In fact, it's really designed for portraiture. But if you actually use it sometimes and you just experiment, it can actually create some quite interesting things. And here, what it's done is kind of lightened the center of that really, really broody storm sky. And just provided a little bit of light on the horizon. You could do it manually with the dodge tool. I'm not suggesting you need dark and light center, but it certainly prompted me to have the idea. Atmosphere. Even simple pictures with very little other than a bit of snow with a leaden sky. But the beauty of going out and photographing snow images when it is still snowing and you haven't got a lovely chocolate box blue sky is that the leaden, misty, snow-covered sky often hides other things in the background. So all you get is these skeletal trees which stand out and provide a much stronger image. So let's look at some classic Lake District composition. Here you've got a nice picture of Blee Tarn, foreground, lead-in lines, reflection, looking across to the Langdales, but it's relatively flat light, isn't it? And if this was judged, this would be considered to be a nice classic landscape, but it would get a fairly mediocre mark. But you can change that with very little extra work. So here you've got exactly the same image following Photoshop dodging and burning. That's all it is. A bit of tonal contrast in Nick, but be careful with that because it can give you halos, and the last thing you want is to give the judge halos over the mountain edges. And finally, I've tidied up the rocks because another bit of judge bait is with the rocks coming out of the bottom of the picture there, as you can see, and they look quite really as balanced. But here I've just moved the one on the right up a little bit, taken one out and moved that one in a bit so it's not going out of the picture. So it provides more of a lead in to where your eye wants to go. And that's what judges need. We're simple folk. We need to have the image show us where to look. And all these components come together to bump up your marks. I said earlier that you sometimes get flat overhead light, and you could be in the location that you want to take your pictures. You can't always get somewhere, unless it happens to be a local destination for sunrise and sunset. But here, although the light is overhead and flat, the sun was hitting the sandbank and working quite nicely. And together with the boat in the position it is, it just adds, suddenly you've got a composition that works where the boat is absolutely spot on the thirds, and you've got these nice lines that are being worked. So even if you are stuck with a bright overhead day, keep the sky to an absolute minimum. Clearly you can't chop the sky off always, and in this particular image I have tried, and it doesn't really work without having the mountain and a little bit of sky. But certainly if you can avoid having any sky, then you can get away with it. Here it was a very deep blue sky, as you can imagine. This is in Namibia, but by actually just taking the sky out and just using the dune as the background and then the nice lead-in line, you've got these dead trees that just really ideally, luckily for me there's three, but they work quite well in the composition and no sky needed at all. Here another scene of Buttermere, an overcast, dull colour landscape image. And again, I'm sure the judges in the audience will have had these pictures presented to you in the same way as I have many, many times. And your heart goes out to the author because it really is never going to do particularly well. But I'm really just trying to make the point, a bit of time spent on post-production, and in this case, I think converting to mono has really worked. You can turn it into something quite spectacular. It may not be everyone's cup of tea, but it's certainly a lot better than that in terms of giving a little bit of wow factor to the image, and finally finished off in silver effects in Nick. Ice caves. We went and photographed ice caves for the first time. I've lost track of time now. We've been locked down for so long, but certainly a couple of years ago. And they are amazingly photogenic. And you get a bit carried away because you've got all these colours and all these kind of blues come out of the ice when you're underneath a glacier, and it's quite fantastic. But you need to try and create a composition. You need something to sort of look through to, and so you use the sort of the mountains and a bit of snow beyond to create that look through view. But while we were there, this person, much to the annoyance, I have to say, because there was about 6 other photographers in this cave at the time, were all shouting at this person to get out of the way. And I took this picture because, although some might say, you know, it doesn't add anything to it, what the person does is it actually provides tremendous scale and a focal point to this shot of the ice cave. Now, some judges may opt for the other image. Some judges may like the fact it's got scale and a focal point. Obviously, that's just a chance you take. But it's worth, if the opportunity presents it, to take both. So, to sum up, a landscape needs both good light and good composition. One or the other doesn't work. This scene, both taken in Glencoe, as you can see, famous black cottages, black rock cottages, I should say, are in pretty flat light and just don't work. I mean, they're very commonly photographed image. And here you've got a view down Glencoe, nice bit of light coming down there, but no real composition. But if you can get the two together, you get a very pleasing image. Now, this is a bit chocolate boxy, I know, but the point is illustrated here, really, that the light is quite nice. The light on the cottage lifts them up, and then you've got some light on the rocks in the foreground again, helping to sort of anchor the image, and then the sky and the mountain beyond, it's got some light picking it up, so it makes it so much more attractive and hopefully a better scored image. So a bit on to exposure, and it doesn't just apply obviously to landscapes. Exposure is right across the board. An image, you all know, an image with burnt out highlights or blocked up shadows will always score badly, and because some scenes have an extreme tonal range, our cameras just can't record it, and they do need a bit of help. Graduated filters you can use on the camera, certainly it does help, or you could even, in a raw image, you can actually use graduated filters in software now, and you can make quite a few adjustments. But if you've got a really extreme range, quite often HDR is the method you have to resort to. But your biggest help in all this, now we've got digital cameras, and now we don't have to worry about film, sending it off and waiting 3 weeks to wonder whether we've got an image or not. The histogram will tell you everything you need to know. The little JPEG image on the back of the camera is not a very good means of relying upon a good exposure. Yes, it will give you an idea, and if you convert your color space to Adobe RGB, it will actually improve marginally the quality of that JPEG on the back of the camera, but it's no substitute for using the histogram. And here, to illustrate this, you can see that this image, this canyon, you've got sun hitting one wall and the other wall, because this is exposed for the sunlit side of the canyon, the other side is in very deep shadow. Consequently, the histogram that you can see is thrown right across to the left. Here, photographing and exposing for the shadow has blown the highlight out, and here the histogram has gone way over to the right hand side. So that's basically the two extremes you've got. So with the use of HDR technology, and I'm not making a big plug for HDR because it can look a little bit overdone, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But this has been processed in Photomatics Pro, and you can see now, I'm really using this to illustrate the histogram more than the actual image you're looking at. Look at the histogram now and see just how you've got a gap at both ends, and this is what you're aiming for on the back of your camera, but you can't always achieve that without some other means, and this is where things like HDR blending come into play. So this is Photomatics Pro, and this is a screenshot of what you get. And different image this time. This is Buckle in Glenetive, Mount Buckle, and this is taking one stop over, one stop under, and the average light reading, because there was some real bright light hitting the mountain top, as you can see. But when you use these presets, which are down the right hand side, you can see that this particular preset I've chosen is enhance, and you can see what the enhance mode of tone mapping has done to the image. It's actually blown the tip of the mountain out, and it's pushed the histogram up in the top corner there, though you can't see it all. Its tails off to the right hand side, indicating where the highlight is blown. But by just shifting the preset from enhanced to natural, instantly you can see now that that histogram is moved back into the center, and it's no longer blowing out that highlight. So by the simple effect of blending three images together and going through a natural effect, you've now got a nice image, nothing blown out, and one that works pretty successfully. And all this has had is a little bit of a vignette put on to hold the corners on. We'll talk about vignettes a bit later on as well, because they're things also that often judges pull up images over. But that is the final picture, and you've got away without blowing anything out or blocking anything up. Choice of shutter speed for water. This is a personal preference. Some people absolutely hate slow water that gives it this nice silky effect. I absolutely adore it. And I just think it adds so much to the image. So I lay my cards down right now. But if you are going to do this, you do need to have something to anchor the eye to. So you've got to have some rocks in the image so that the eye isn't just looking at all this blurry water, so that the judge knows that you aren't doing intentional camera movement. You have in fact purposely chosen a slow shutter speed to create a nice movement in the water, but you have got very sharp rocks to throw the image into relief. And the final thing is always a little bit of thing you have to be a little bit careful about when you're going for a slow shutter speed and you've got water involved. You get quite often some bright spots, and you don't want to be blowing out those highlights. So just a few simple images to illustrate the process really of a slow shutter speed, and these are all taken between about a fifth and a half a second, but they've all got something to lock on, whether it be a branch, a rock with a twig or leaf on, or just a rock sticking out of the waterfall. They all need something to help them work. And it doesn't just happen to be waterfalls. You can use long exposures for sea or even sky to produce a different image, something that's a little bit unusual. This was taken 2.5 seconds. Really, it's all about, with shots like this, and you've got the tide, you want the water dragging itself back over the rocks, and you can count how many seconds it takes and then experiment so that with your ISO to actually get that, or you can actually shoot on bulb, on B setting with a cable release and go from that. But you will probably need neutral density filters. Now, neutral density filters come in a variety now. Once upon a time, I think big stoppers came out and everyone had one. That was about 10 stops. But now they go right up to 15 or even more now. But generally speaking, between about 3 and 15 stops, you would kind of have them in your bag. But if you don't want to spend all that money, and it is a lot of money, particularly high-end ones, because cheap ones can give you terrible color casts, I would recommend getting the 6-stop one, which I find is generally the most useful, the one used more now. In lead terms, that's called a little stopper as opposed to a big stopper. But it does create, as you can see in the sky, lovely ethereal quality, and then you've got this kind of almost like mist-like effect coming up around the rocks. And here it's really been used for the sky. Saw these clouds scudding along, and they really do look very nice when you get these lovely trails, particularly if your image is focused on the sky, so you've got a lot of big sky and a very low horizon. Then it's worth trying to get quite a good effect with a neutral density filter, and here 20th of a second. Seascapes. This seascape, I liked it for quite a long time, but it never really kind of worked for me. And then I did a few things which made it, changed it very, very much, almost sort of overnight, really. First of all, I worked it so I flipped it so that now the line in the sand runs from left to right. I also lightened it a little bit to make it obvious for the judge, just in case their eyesight isn't quite good enough and they can't actually see what I'm trying to show them in terms of the leading line and the focal points. And obviously then your eye ends up on the ice. And then I'm thinking, well, the ice is just breaking horizon. Is that going to be judge bait or is it not? So I played around and increased. I took the water line up, the horizon line up slightly, but then you lose that little bit of ice because the ice then kind of gets lost. So I think the compromise I've gone for here, and it's done reasonably well, is with the ice just breaking the skyline. Another shot where, again, I owned and ahed about the ice, little blocks of ice over in the top right. Do they work, do they not? And I finally came down to the conclusion that I think they balance the picture with the small piece of ice, the larger one, the little wiggle in the sort of the beach, the black sand beach there, and then those two, I think, balance the image off. Again, it's a chance. Judge may say, oh, I think I've liked it without those two bits, but that's a chance you take, and you have to sort of go through these thought processes to come up with really what you think is the best image. All I can offer you is the thought processes to go through. Here you've got a bit more on composition and using the line. So here we've got the classic S-shaped composition, waiting for the tide to come in. So when you've got a beautiful black sand beach like we have here in Iceland, it really is worthwhile waiting. So you've got some nice foam to come up to create the shape. You don't want it going all the way up and past that rock, and it did several times. So I kind of waited until I got what I thought worked as a reasonable shape to take your eye in, stop at the rock there, and then takes you all the way around to the rock, the sea stacks, right across on the horizon on the right hand side. And this is just really playing around with different ideas, and sometimes it's worth coming up with some different things, particularly if you are going to do maybe a panel of images. Sometimes it works by doing differential focus. And so here, using differential focus, focus on the grass so they're sharp, but use an aperture of about f8 so the background isn't completely out of focus. You can actually see what it is. It just isn't as sharp, so that the judge can actually see that your point of focus are the grasses. Other things that judges love to point out are sloping horizons. Now, I know none of you have sloping horizons like this, and there's really no excuse nowadays, but if you're anything like me, I get a bit carried away in the moment, and I invariably get a sloping horizon, not quite as exaggerated as this for the benefit of the making the point, but I do get a sloping horizon. And so what I've got into the habit of doing now is always taking more than I actually need. So in a shot like this of the Giant's Causeway in County Antrim, and you've got these obelisks as well, you've got these basalt, as you can see, these basalt rocks. And they tend to, when you actually take the image, you can quite often get them leaning a little bit because you haven't quite got everything straight. And unless you've got a tilt and shift lens, sometimes, depending on how wide you're shooting or the angle you're shooting at, it sometimes can get a little bit distorted. But when you straighten all these things up, which you can very easily in post-production, then you start to have to crop the image a bit more to then end up with all these straightened lines and horizons and so on. And when you start to crop the image, you can run the risk of losing your original composition, what you actually saw. So that's why I take a bit more. So when I've straightened things up, when I crop, I end up with what I originally saw. And it works many, many times. Back in the day, when I first started out in photography, the only way you could actually do that was to take one step back, because there weren't such things as zoom lenses. But now, of course, we can just pull back a little bit with our zoom lens. Okay, there will be a break in this in case those of you are dying to refill your wine, beer, gin, coffee, tea, or whatever. But I just thought we would do a little bit more before we have a break. So I just want to talk a little bit about sport, because sport can do quite well, but there's a few rules that you just really need to bear in mind. So quite often sport does better in mono. Sometimes it can give it a much higher impact. The crop that you choose is really important to avoid distractions. And sometimes you just need to take a judgment call on whether the crowd adds to the image or detracts from the image. And so when you get a shot like this, where the guy clearly is going to get a try, is right on the line, and the crowd are cheering him on, then sometimes having the crowd not bitingly sharp, a little bit out of focus, as long as your player is sharp and in focus, then it can actually add to the storytelling value of the image. Same it goes here. Without those spectators in the background, this image didn't work. So I took them from another shot and I put them in. And it makes the image so much more acceptable. It fills that gap at the top and just adds more to the storytelling value of the image. So the subject of colour or mono. Now, I think mono, generally speaking, gives you a more powerful sports image. But funnily enough, in this image, and it may be something to do with the ball, I don't know, but this image the colour image has done better. You can just about see the ball between the guy's legs. The image is called Spot the Ball. And I'm not very original with my titles. And the colour image, maybe it's the vibrancy, I don't know, but it's often done better than the mono. So it really is, you pay your money, you take your chance. A bit about floodlight. Quite often, if you are going to do a sporting event, you may well be end up having to photograph it under floodlights. And floodlight isn't all bad because it gives you a very even light. So the best way I can advise to shoot is to actually select a shutter speed. So I shoot always in aperture priority for everything except this type of work where you are shooting under floodlight. So shutter speed about a 2,000th of a second. The aperture will sort itself out, and just use auto ISO and let the ISO adjust itself so that you maintain that fast shutter speed and you'll be working off your lens's widest aperture. And that is about the best way. Because they're running up and down the pitch, they're going from one side to the other, you can't be messing around. So you really just need to set it up and go that way. Some people may prefer to go down the manual route and do a few trials. That's another option. I just prefer to use auto ISO. Capturing the moment. When you are photographing sports, the judges will be just looking for the moment. They won't necessarily be studying all the other aspects of the shot. They want to see the expressions of anguish, of winning, and that's really what you've got to capture. The high jump is a really difficult sport to actually capture the moment. The reason why I say that is because there's only one image of the high jump, and this is it. Before and after doesn't work. You've got to get the arch, and you've got to get in there this absolute one single moment. And if you see this in the viewfinder, you've missed it. You have got to start firing on the run up, lock your focus on, and then hope that your motor drive is driving enough frames a second to ensure that you actually get the one you want. But this is the image you want in the high jump. In the long jump, there are other things that come into play. Now, you want to get the guy in the air, or you may even want to get him landing. Sometimes if all the sand flies up, that too creates quite a powerful image. But the problem with the long jump quite often can be is that because they really do kind of throw themselves up, and you really do want to get them underneath them because they're coming down towards you, so you want to get their face, they can actually end up as a silhouette. So you really do have to avoid underexposing the long jumper. And in this case, you can see it was the sun came out, and it did actually make it very, very contrasty. In many ways, I'm one of these people that absolutely loathe the sun for all types of photography, nature photography, sports photography. The sun is your worst enemy in many ways. It lowers your ISO, but it does create very, very difficult lighting to get your images right sometimes. But when the sun's not out, you can get other conditions. And in wet conditions, it's very unpleasant. And I'm not advocating you want to go out with your equipment in torrential rain, but it does actually give you some very different take on sports images. And just a word of caution, because I've learned the hard way. When you're out in these sort of conditions, don't overly worry about your camera. Now, I see lots of people they've got all their cameras all bundled up. It's the lens that you need to worry about. The lenses are where the dampness gets in. And it gets in to between the elements in the lens. And once, condensation gets in there, it takes a long time to dry it out. Camera bodies generally are pretty well sealed. Certainly most decent camera bodies, decent SLRs or mirrorless high-end ones or higher-end ones come with quite good weather sealing. And although I'm not saying you just want to drop in a puddle, it's the lens you really do need to focus on. Portraits and people and getting the lighting right and getting the composition right as well. So putting the eyes of a portrait on the top third sometimes can be as important as positioning something in a landscape image. And if you get that right, you also want to obviously combine it with the catch lights. You don't want dull, lifeless eyes. You want bright eyes to be basically jumping out at the judge when they're viewing it. And keep the background simple and unobtrusive and ideally appropriate for the subject that you're actually photographing. So just a few things before we have a break on the types of lighting. So this is low level light to help the storytelling. So you can cut this is a straight shot in a studio, but it's ideal to be cut out and put into some other type of setting. And I've put them in a woodland setting, and it works very well indeed. So you've got the low light simulating the lantern light. You've got the light coming up on the hand and just the face, and it gives you a lot of freedom to work and do what you want. Here, more traditional lighting. So this has got the main light on the left, and then a fill-in can even just be a reflector on the right-hand side, and then just a rear light to separate from the background, put a bit of light on the hair. And this is natural window light. It really does give you a much softer light, and in this case I just did a little bit of skin softening post-production as well, which quite often works very well on female models. You don't have to do that on male models, and in fact it's worth going for more of a gritty feel. But this is just a few simple props. So these props were purchased on eBay. They're not real ones, but when you actually add them to the image, it just kind of adds to the storytelling and makes it a bit more interesting. And here I took the top of the bowler hat off just to put the eye on the thirds to help the composition. And as I was saying about female models, it's the opposite with male models. You can really punch up the gritty, rough texture to enhance the drama of your image. And props again can provide a different thing. This is going the other way, so this is trying to create a bygone feel by using one single light, which they used to use a lot in Hollywood, and the model obviously has taken a kind of just borrowed the same hat as used there, but assume that sort of Hollywood pose, and I just used sepia tone and then a bit of aging around it to add to it, and it did very well in a competition that was, I think, called Bygone Days. Photographing people at events. I'm sure you've all been to, the Born Survivor and the other various events. We have quite a few up here, and they're well worth going to. Although the organisers tend to be a little bit snooty sometimes if you turn up with a very large camera, because they think you're professional and you're going to be selling them, and they've already paid a professional, no doubt, to provide images. But you can come away with some very good images. You have to be a little bit concerned about the background, or if you are going to get background, try and make it complementary to the subject matter, and maybe not totally out of focus, but out of focus enough so it's not competing with your main subject. This is Edinburgh Festival. You may well have seen this young woman who poses as a clown to hand out leaflets. Absolutely beautiful expressions on her face. But the backgrounds are really, really difficult in things like Edinburgh, and you really do have to move around and try to give a lot of thought to this, or even do quite a bit of work post-production. Here I was very lucky. This person actually was standing against a wall, and so consequently I was able to get a reasonably clean background. All I've done is darken it down. Beamish, another favourite haunt. Here the guard, very happy to pose, and of course I'm sure you've all got plenty of pictures like this. The only thing that I did, I flipped it because, again, I didn't feel it looked right going from right to left. But the thing that took me the longest was to change the word guard back again the right way round. That was a nightmare to fix. Well, I say a nightmare, it just took longer than flipping the image. Appleby Horse Fair. Again, you get some really interesting characters and great images. You just need to do, if necessary, a bit of work to darken down so that the character stands out from the background. So the background can be as important sometimes as the picture itself, particularly if it's got a lot of distractions. This is a travel shot, and in strict travel competitions you aren't able to do things like take the distractions out. But if it's not a travel competition, you can do the hell you like. So as you can see in the bottom shot, I've tidied it up and made it a much more easy and judge bait free image. But if it's say a travel image, then all you can do is darken things down. Organised photo shoots with people can also give you the opportunity to pose your models. They do a few set poses, but you get the opportunity to do a little bit yourself. This is the one and only timeline event that we've been to, and it was okay. I wouldn't say you come away with anything specifically different to other people, but you can move around, you can change your angle, and I just wanted to try and create something similar to Brief Encounter, and I think it presented a reasonable image, and it's done reasonably well. And this is just playing around. There was the light there was the steam, and the policeman did actually have a pair of old handcuffs, so tried something a little bit different, using the handcuffs as the point of focus, becoming the main point of the image. And finally, to finish on people, before we do stop, is street photography. Street photography is one of these areas where sometimes pictures can do quite well and sometimes they don't. And unless you're entering a specific street photography competition, which you may well be, then obviously it's fairly straightforward. You just take what images you've got that fit that title. But sometimes they can do quite well in ordinary competitions as well. And mono often gives you, again, another powerful kind of gritty effect for your image. Now, I put this in to illustrate that if you had just taken the picture of the painting, which is a painting, believe it or not, it's the artist whose name escapes me, who actually produces paintings that look like photographs, even to the point that he puts in a minimal depth of field, can you believe? Very, very clever guy. But what for me made the image was this other guy looking at this painting. And that's when it moves away, because you're adding your own personal interpretation to it, and you remove it from that accusation of a record shot. Same here. This is the British Museum with that fantastic, very, very much recited phrase. But if you put a person in, and I didn't put the person in, I took the person out to illustrate the point, actually. I saw the person walking and just waited for them to walk. And now you've got a bit of storytelling in your record shot. Now this is just opportunism. Another record photograph. probably. But can you actually believe that I was in Central Park in New York, and these three girls were all reading a Jamie Oliver book. Now, what are the odds of that? A, Jamie Oliver's not American, and three girls all sat next to each other, all reading the same book. But yes, it's true, I didn't set it up. What I did set up is ask the girls to hold the book up and just look over the top. Sadly, I had to snatch it quite quick because they were about to go, and I asked them to sit back down again. The girl in the middle didn't hold her book up quite high enough, but that's my loss. But I put it in to illustrate that sometimes if you do see a scene and you think it might just work better if you do something, then most people are quite happy, and it can just add to the strength of the composition. Underpasses work really well, particularly when they're really graffitied up. And here, the underpass works pretty well on its own. But again, it becomes kind of a record shot until a figure starts to walk into the image. And here, the figure was a pretty imposing figure. I think worked and added, particularly when you've got the reflection of the puddle in the underpass as well. And you've got, again, the nice image of Manhattan with these beautiful walls. These are stainless steel walls, which are a part of the memorial in New Jersey to 9/11, and they reflect the sky and everything around them. And so I took many pictures of this, but I just thought this one has the figure in it, and suddenly it's kind of lifted from a record to an image that's actually had some sort of composition thought going into it. And just finally to another shot. This was also taken in New York, but this is Central Park under the underpass there. And this girl walked down the steps, and I took quite a few images. And it's really just a question of making a decision as to when it actually works, when all the elements come together that actually makes your image work. And I know Cartier-Bresson called it capturing the moment. And I think it is right that you do need to sometimes be a bit of luck to capture the moment. But certainly it works, and sometimes street photography pays off. Hang on, yes we have. So you have got a break. I've gone a bit longer than I thought. Titles in competitions work really well, and if they are allowed, always use them, because it does help the judge interpret your image. I'm sure you all know that if you enter an associateship panel for the Royal Photography Association for a Society, or even a fellowship panel, you have to produce what's called a statement of intent. And the reason why you have to do that is because they read that out and they then measure your work by your statement. Well, the same happens in a much smaller way with a title and the judge. The judge will look at the title, and although the title won't necessarily improve the image, it will give the judge some sort of clue as to what you're trying to say, and then the judge can interpret as to whether you've achieved what you're saying in the title. So if you have got the opportunity, I certainly urge you to use titles to good effect. So yeah, last couple of slides on people or associated with people. Sharpness and focus. So here I'm stating the obvious, that the judge will be looking for a sharp image, particularly the eyes in a portrait or a nature, if indeed it's a close-up nature image. So you do need to ensure that you present sharp images and images that are in focus where they need to be. There are three main reasons for an image being unsharp. The first one, fairly obvious, is poor focus. The second one is an inappropriate depth of field. And the third one is camera shape. And whilst some would say the removal of excessive noise in noise reduction software will soften an image, and yes it will, but it will rarely be the cause of a lack of sharpness. But generally, in my experience, the reason why images are unsharp is normally because too slow a shutter speed was selected for the lens being used. And this becomes more and more common with people who use smaller compact cameras, where the lens, although very small, can have quite a long magnification. And people just don't realize that they are using such a powerful lens, and consequently you do get camera movement. A couple of things still on focus. The choice of focus points often get asked. I personally use one single focus point for virtually everything, unless it's a moving subject like a flying bird or something, and then a few points to lock on are worth, so a few more focus points. The other thing on focusing is how to actually focus correctly in the first place. Most people use the shutter button, which has focusing built in. If you want to move to the next level, you may have already done so, but if you haven't, I would commend you to try and look into using your back focus button as your primary source of focus, and disable your shutter button. This enables you to lock on to whatever you want to photograph, and then when you press the shutter, it doesn't refocus. So you can lock on and then move, so that you've locked onto the eyes, and as long as you're not moving backwards and forwards, you can recompose your image, and you know that you've got what you want sharp. It does work very well both in portraiture and indeed even in landscapes. So it is worthwhile remembering it. And I touched on depth of field, so I'll finish with this image before we break on depth of field. Depth of field, I'm not going to try and teach my grandmother to suck eggs. You all know about depth of field. And really your choice of depth of field does depend on what you want to do with it. So you can use selective depth of field to be very creative. But the wrong choice of depth of field can actually sometimes result in what you want to be sharp being out of focus. But in fact, if you get it right, it can actually give you quite an interesting image with a nice, attractive out of focus background. And for those of you who may be beginners and not quite got your head around how it works with an aperture, this very, very simple diagram illustrates that very, very clearly, I think. So if you're shooting wide open, f2.8, you can see, if you look down at the bottom, I'm not going to worry about all the other bits, but you will have, come on to lenses, but you will have a relatively small depth of field, so your background will be blurry. If you go up to the other end, f22, so now you've really stopped down your lens, you will have everything sharp. So that's really the two extremes. Now this changes a little bit with the lens. So a wide angle lens will always give you a wider depth of field, and a telephoto lens, depending on how long it is, will actually compress things and give you a small depth of field. But that's a whole subject in itself, and I'm certainly not going to keep you from your tea, beer, coffee, tea, by nattering on about that. Okay, enough of talking about people and sharpness. Now let's talk about nature and sharpness, a subject near and dear to my heart. Nature photography is one of these subjects that quite often is handicapped in some competitions, particularly with the PAGB federations, because traditionally nature images do quite well. But don't run away with the idea that any old nature image will do well. It has to be still a good, strong nature image, and it still has to observe some of the rules, even though the judge may not fully appreciate or indeed even discuss when assessing the image. But they still are important. So you need the bird with space to look into, ideally on the thirds. You need the eyes maybe on the top third and so on. But with backgrounds, they can sometimes be more important than the image. I put this up to illustrate that. So here you've got quite an interesting picture of a barn owl in the bottom image. The barn owl's got a mouse. Its perch is not overly attractive, but it's got a mouse, and it's got, therefore, more storytelling value. But the background is really distracting. You've got these really bright spots, and you've got quite strong shadows on the face, so you've no detail in the eyes either. Switch to the top image, and you've got a beautiful neutral background, an interesting perch, but no mouse, so lacking the storytelling value. So here you've got a little bit of a conundrum, because storytelling value in the judging rule book should actually have certainly a weighting in the judging of a nature image. Obviously, if it's an open competition, then the image will be judged along with all the other images. But let's just focus on nature for a moment. So sometimes, although the story is important, and as I say, the rule book does suggest that you should give weighting to the storytelling value, if it is a poor technical and not a particularly well composed image, it still will, just because it's got a bit of storytelling value, it still will not get a particularly good mark. What you need is a combination of all those elements. So here you've got good light, you've got good storytelling, because you've got a barn owl about to land, having caught itself a mouse, and you've got a nice woodland background. So once you put all those elements together, you get a successful image. But let's talk about birds on sticks for a moment, because, you know, birds on sticks do get a bit of bad press, wrongly in my book, but nevertheless. But again, if you've got a bird on a stick, you do need a nice sympathetic background for that stick. Nice catch light in the eye, and certainly something that all comes together. Now, if you look at the bottom image here, you've got exactly the same bird. It was sat on this perch, got no light in its eye, and it's got an awful background. And it is just a matter of waiting. I can't emphasize more how wildlife photography is about waiting to get it right. And quite often I think it's quite sad that some judges don't take that into account and will be quite dismissive. So I'll come on to that. This is about the angle. This is the other aspect of nature photography that you need to get right if you're wanting to get into it, or indeed even if you only just dabble. You need to get down to an intimate eye level with your subject matter, because this actually strengthens the image and absolutely blasts the image full of impact for the judge to look at. If you actually look down on something, you actually diminish its importance in terms of the viewer, and therefore it doesn't work. And I think that's fairly well illustrated in these two images here. So I apologise in advance, but I'm going to have a brief rant on the subject of birds and judges. So basically, the story of the kingfisher has gone on and on. It's now been replaced, but just bear with me. So kingfishers, when they were on a bulrush or on a stick, used to get a pretty good mark, and then the bar went up, and then the bird had to have a fish in its beak when landing on the stick, and then they had to be exploding out of the water having caught the fish. But they don't just have to explode out. Well, they have to be coming the right way with a light in the eye. And if any of you have tried this, you'll know that kingfishers, no matter how many times you try it, don't always come out the right way. Once they dived and got their fish, they could go one of 360 degrees. So it's all about a bit of luck when you get it, and also taking a lot. But now the bar is so high that this is the sort of shot that is now being recognised in quite a lot of the salons where the bird is actually underwater catching the fish. But you'll be all pleased to know that the kingfishers now have been passed over to the Dalmatian pelican. This is now the bird that gets, you see so many of these comments. But to me, and I'm sure the judges in the audience will agree with me, that if it stands out as a good image of a pelican or a good image of a kingfisher, it should be judged as such. It doesn't matter how many are out there, because this one may be the one that stands out. And that's what you should be aiming for in your pictures. This is the raw file of a couple of barn owls, an organised shoot. Organised shoots are really good for capturing different images because you get the chance to do it. In the wild, it's really hard. You've obviously got to stalk your place out. You've got maybe set up a portable hide, and rarely do you get interaction between the birds. Quite often they're quite solitary. So this is an opportunity. If you do go to an organised shoot and you want to get into this, you do actually get the chance to get some quite strong and successful images. Now, they do need quite a bit of work. The first work is pretty obvious, as you can see, is that if you put it into an open competition, you can take the jesses away. If you put it into a nature competition, you can't remove the jesses, but you can do all the rest. So here, this has been post-processed and the jesses have been removed, and it's been a very successful image. But all the work I've done, with the exception of taking the jesses away, is all perfectly allowed in the rules. So this is a matter of where you want to place your image. But if you're putting it into an open competition, as we started out talking about, then you can put something like this in the perfect knowledge that it is competing with other images. So it's not just competing in a nature image, it could be competing against a steam train. It doesn't matter. So just to repeat what I was saying a moment ago, that the storytelling value is what judges are guided towards taking into account when doing it. But as I say, this isn't something you can heavily rely on to serve up an inferior image, and in fact some judges may not have even read the guidelines about the storytelling quality of the image. So a bit about how you can widen out your chances. So in a competition, so let's say you don't do nature, you don't do portraits, but you probably do go to zoos if it's with your kids, your grandkids. So take a picture in a zoo. This tiger was taken in the zoo. This picture was taken on holiday of my son in a swimming pool. Now, I'm not holding them up to be earth-shattering gold medal winning pictures, but they are reasonable pictures that have had reasonable marks in the past. And this is what I'm trying to get across, is that even if it's not something that you do, have a go, and you may be pleasantly surprised that you suddenly get a decent mark. Let's look at monochrome. For your basic good quality monochrome, you need a good range of tones, and I'm sure you've all heard this, you've all read this, and you probably all know this. So you need really all the tones right through from black through to white for it to be a good monochrome. Now you can get high key, you can get low key, but for your bog standard monochrome, then you need to be aiming for a nice range of tones. So none of that slow water blown out, and detail where it's needed. But sometimes monochrome can really add a bit of drama that colour doesn't really do. So here you've got, again, I guess it could be accused of a record shot. It's a shot taken down in Antarctica of a disused whaler. But by turning it into a bit of a gritty monochrome, suddenly it adds some drama, and I think it just takes it away from being a straight record shot. Try wildlife in black and white. Certainly what you do with black and white in wildlife is you make the image a lot simpler, because you take out the contrasting colours, which sometimes can be quite distracting from what you're trying to say in your image. And this is given a mono with a high key treatment, and high key works really well with pictures, particularly in Africa, places like Africa where the grasses are very, very yellow, very almost white. It works very well indeed. Here you've just got a dramatic low angle of an elephant, and certainly now I'm a bit older and maybe a bit wiser. I don't know whether I would lay out in front of a bull elephant walking towards me, taken with a wide angle lens, but there's by the by. But in colour, this image doesn't work. You've got blue sky, you've got fluffy clouds, but in mono, it just has so much more drama and dramatic effect. The same with this leopard. The colour version doesn't work. You've got the sort of green foliage, and all I've done here is put a heavy vignette on it and turned it to monochrome. And it's been a very successful image, got into Edinburgh and has done very well. And literally all it is a heavy vignetted monochrome image of a leopard, nothing special. And sometimes just converting from colour to mono can mean the difference between one image doing well and one image not doing well. So the colour image, nothing. The colours in the background were always found to be distracting by judges. Turning it into mono, no longer the case. A bit about white balance and colour casts. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this because everyone sees colour differently. But sometimes you can be accused of having a colour cast and the image can be marked down. And so you really do need to have some sort of basic idea of how you present your images. The white balance is less of a problem nowadays. The more, as cameras have advanced, the auto white balance has become better and better. Back a few years, auto white balance in digital cameras used to be a bit of a nightmare. I personally still use my own setting, Kelvin setting, and Julie leaves hers on cloudy all the time. But if you're shooting in RAW, you can adjust it anyway. Colour casts, again, as I say, you can correct them, but you just need to be able to spot them. If you do have a problem with seeing colour, then it's worth asking a family member. But here, this to illustrate, so the top one is cyan on the right, the bottom one's got a magenta cast, and then the one on the left is the correct version. So you say it's quite subtle. If you can see that, then you can test yourself. In terms of prints, you can hit the problem then of getting colour casts through either your printer or your profiles or both. So if you are printing, then it's worth obtaining free profiles for your paper and your printer from the paper manufacturer. Over sharpening. You are always going to get a judge point out over sharpening. In fact, sometimes it's better to get away with a slightly soft image than an over sharpened one. And you can see I've put this picture up to exaggerate the point, but you can see the really telltale halos on the edges of the mountainside there. Now, yes, you can get them out. It is a tedious nightmare of a job to do, and worth not bothering personally. It's better to selectively sharpen. You rarely need to sharpen the sky, so you don't need to sharpen the whole image, but it's better to, through a layer and a layer mask, to sharpen what areas you need, and do it at 100% so that you can actually see what you're doing, and hopefully it will improve the image without putting the judge off. Dirty sensor. Again, I know I'm stating the obvious, but I've lost marks because there's a spot that I haven't noticed and the judge has taken great pleasure in finding it. So I just point it out to you. Again, it's worth enlarging your image to 100%, particularly in the sky and light parts, and then just slowly go over it, looking for sometimes these spots that you might have on your sensor. And then with the healing brush, it's really, really easy to get rid of them. And once you've discovered these wonderful plug-in filters, getting a bit carried away can get a judge shaking their head with an overcooked image. So don't be tempted to give such a wacky, almost sort of image that the world has come to an end. It won't really get you any particularly high marks. It's always best to try and get a natural look as to what you saw originally. Different crops don't always present the 4x3 or 3x2 on how it was taken. Try some different stuff. A letterbox shape sometimes can enhance a landscape. And funnily enough, square format landscape now, see quite a lot of them. They're becoming quite popular. Square format is becoming quite popular for lots of things, but even square format landscapes. Converging verticals and perspective distortion. Again, sometimes it can be done for effect. Sometimes it really will cause a judge to delight in pointing it out to you, and obviously the image will get less marks. So if you've got an image you particularly like, you can correct most of the distortions in post-production. Now the tools are there to correct perspective, but it can be a bit time-consuming. I thought this image was quite unusual. It's not an image I particularly would say it's done okay in the right competition in humour, but as far as it goes, it took quite a lot of work to correct all those perspectives and to clean it all up and to present it as a reasonable image. But in certainly an image like this, where you are intentionally using the converging verticals to create quite a strong image, and I think it works. But if you are going for an image like this, think about the sky. Putting in a sky suddenly removes that little bit of kind of judge bait because it's quite bright.
No, I prefer the previous one.
And certainly, if you want to sort of pump up the contrast to make it a little bit more punchy, then suddenly it does become a little bit more interesting. Again, it's a personal thing, but it's something that will often be noticed. So judging is about trying to get the best images from a large number, and this can sometimes literally just come down to a bit of nitpicking. So if you have got an image like this one in particular, declutter it, because the judge will take pleasure in pointing out the little bit of paper on the corner there, the little bit of chalk on the corner of the desk there. I know it sounds petty, but I'm telling you what happened to this image by a judge. And also, don't let the judge get distracted. Here you've got a nice picture. You've got the bird on the nest, you've got the youngsters, but you've got the tail of one of the egrets sticking into the image. And the judge will focus on that rather than what you're trying to present. And, you know, it's just a shame, but you've lost the chance to really do it. So if necessary, even if you have to be quite vicious, crop it out. And if you are talking of cropping, if you've got an image that's quite close to the edge of the frame, sometimes it could lose the odd mark or two if it actually runs out of the picture. So again, judges will say, I'd like to see a bit more room around the image. So sometimes just increase the canvas size or clone a bit more in to fill around it. Or, you know, if it's a tree and you can retake it, then cut a bit off the tree and retake it. But certainly now, with content aware in Photoshop, in the crop tool, it will actually fill it in for you. Obviously, if you've got something going out, it will fill that in again, but it will give you a bit more room around your image, and then you can adjust it. So it's a relatively easy fix. If you've got an image that has a lot of dark areas and light areas in them, try and keep detail in them rather than going completely out. But if you've got images which are predominantly white or black, try and keep them white, avoid them going sort of off grey. Otherwise, again, it will just result in the marks being knocked off. So if it is going to be a nice white Grecian scene, try and keep it so. Judges don't like bits being chopped off, so if you do want to do quite a severe crop on your image, just be aware that it may get picked up. Or if you're going to chop bits off, really make a good job of it so that it looks like you meant to do it. Judges see a lot of images, as I'm sure you can appreciate, and sometimes you might see an image and a style of picture many times before. But sometimes it's not always appreciated that this image may be a new one for the author. And I think this is a fault that all us judges can sometimes be pulled up on. That you see it and you go, oh yeah, you know, it's kind of fairly standard classic design. But of course, everyone's been influenced over the years, right down through the ages, by the masters. So we're not inventing anything new. It's all been done before. So if you do get that comment from a judge, certainly don't give up on that. Just, you know, if this is your image and you like it, it's a nice composition, just stick with it and just ignore what anyone else says. Try something new. Creative photography has now kind of taken off in a big way. So there's nothing wrong at all in trying new stuff. Sometimes judges won't always get it, depending on how obscure it is. But don't be put off by that. Keep ploughing your own furrow, particularly if you are trying new things and breaking new ground. In fact, in international competitions now, there are specific sections for creative photography. But the creative images can be produced in a number of ways. And certainly in the old days, I say the old days, not going back that many years, quite attractive, what were called creative images were produced like this. And there was creative software. This is just a couple of examples. But nowadays, these don't do particularly well. And in many ways, you are handing over your creativity to the software manufacturer rather than producing something yourself. So something like this, which is a very simple, just backlit, diffuse still life, softened, will often do much better than, say, using the software images that so-called give you a painterly effect. Infrared is another creative medium that works really well in quite a lot of images. Not all images work with infrared, as I'm sure you know. So sort of chlorophyll goes white, so green areas will go white. Spring grass, spring foliage is much better than summer foliage, goes much brighter white. Stonework looks really well, and skies where the blue will go black and obviously the white stands out in contrast. So you need to choose your subject matter. You need an overhead sun, because the good thing about infrared is you don't have to get up early because it quite likes overhead light. But certainly it can create good images. A couple of ways to achieve it. You can do it post-production, not really that good. You can buy filters, but that doesn't really work. The only really good way of producing good infrared is to have a sensor converted in an old camera that you don't use and play around, and you can get some very good images. You can do color infrared as well. These happen to be mono infrareds, but certainly color infrared is a bit otherworldly and not necessarily something I would recommend putting into an open competition with a judge, maybe into a specific infrared competition. In camera creativity, and here high key works again. I was saying earlier about African backgrounds work really well. If you've got a subject which has got some dark tones in it and you've got this lovely pale grasses, then go for it. Most high key shots can be achieved relatively easily in camera with about 2 stops plus exposure. This is a bit more unusual. This is a high key landscape, which actually takes on a painterly effect. This hasn't had any painterly filters. This is just a 2-stop exposure, and then post-process by bringing up the blacks a bit so that the blacks actually stand out and give a bit of a 3-dimensional effect. And even high key fine art nude, with the staircase being white, the walls being white, and the little statuette there white, again taken by 2 stops overexposure to kind of create this high key effect. Still life. It's been a bit of a limitation for everyone, hasn't it, with photography over these last 12 months or more. And so photographs of still life have been more and more commonplace. And if you are going to do a still life, try photo stacking. This way it enables you to get front to back sharpness, and if you use a diffuse light, this is taken in a light box, but you can just use an ordinary net curtain, works just as well with some sunlight coming through. I find sunlight works really well to create a diffuse light anyway. You will come up with a reasonably pleasing image. I'm not saying this is a gold medal winning image, but it's in a still life, it is reasonably good and will get a reasonably good mark. Here you've got something a little bit different. This is again a simple still life. This is taken through greaseproof paper put on the window. So using the window light shining through the greaseproof paper and then just standing in front of, so the greaseproof paper comes down, so it creates, so that you haven't got a line, so you just pull it out, keep unrolling the paper as it were, and then you stand the little vase on the paper, keep rolling out, and then what I've done is photographed also the greaseproof paper without any image in it, also backlit, and then put it over the top as a layer and then brush back some of the rows to create the effect. Again, it's about getting some ideas out there for stuff that you can do quite simply and will get reasonably good marks in competitions. Multiple exposures in camera. Again, in creative subject matter, you don't have to sit for hours and hours playing around with Photoshop. This was just 3 multiple exposure images with the camera moved slightly in camera, handheld. And a little jiggle with the camera or a drag shot, and now I think rather pretentiously called ICM. And I know there are quite a few good exponents of ICM. In fact, we have one in Keswick Club. And it's worth, if you are going to have a go at it, it's worth varying your speeds to see what effects you can get. I think about a tenth up to about 2 seconds is the most you want to try. But it's interesting what you can do with different subject matter. So here you've got water. Now the top one is actually moving the camera in a circular motion around the water to create that effect. And the bottom one is actually following the water with the camera. So you're actually dragging it in a horizontal effect. If you want to try something different again, this is a tripod and a panned ICM across a beach and the whole seascape. And finally, this sort of thing is try both. So here you've got a really classic picture of the New York skyline taken from the Rockefeller building, and next to it you've got an ICM shot, but it's not just one ICM shot, it's blended together. So what I did was I took the straight shots and I took a couple of ICM shots and then I blended them together, because sometimes the ICM shot is a little bit too much and sometimes you want a little bit more, and then you've got the opportunity through layers in Photoshop to end up with something that suits you. Using the shutter speed and the lens, again still in camera, to create something a little bit more creative, to create the mood, the moment. And this is a stampede in the migration, but by choosing a 20th of a second, you can see a lot more going on than if you just do a really fast shutter speed where you freeze everything. You don't get the feeling of motion. And it's, again, this is just a variation on that, really. But I spotted this zebra actually standing still, and all these wildebeest were just sort of charging around. So a 30th of a second managed to freeze the zebra, but it was slow enough because these wildebeest were running quite fast to capture the movement of the wildebeest. Just same sort of thing with a jackal. So there was fairly distracting stuff. By doing a blurred background, you also hide stuff that it can be a little bit distracting from your subject matter. So now on to pictures created in Photoshop. This is Julie Walker's department. But they are successful, and I'm not taking anything away from the fact that if you have the skill and the time, then putting, in this case, 6 separate images together through layers can make a very powerful image and do very well in the scores department. Here you've got 8 images of ballet dancer, various poses, then all put together with a background taken in Yellowstone in the winter. This is much more straightforward and simple image of the model, and then put into a composite, and this was entitled The Gallery, which again has done very well. This is one of mine using a very simple technique of a nature image, but using a bit of creativity to take it to a slightly different level. So this orangutan was taken in a zoo, and the grass that it is holding was exactly the same as the one it's got in its hand, which is nearest to you, which is actually on its left hand if we're facing it. And so it looked to me like it was blowing. So I just put this seed head on, and it's just a few seeds going off, and called it He Loves Me, He Loves Me Not. And it's been a very successful image, but a very simple idea. This is an image which is created by quite a popular technique now, which you may have seen, and may even employ yourselves, using the pattern stamp tool, where you actually make a pattern of the background and then through a white layer stamp it over it. This does 2 things. One, it creates a kind of arty texture to it, but it also overcomes an image where you've got a bit of a messy background, and no matter how much you darken it, you can't do much with it. So you basically texturize it and present it like this. And here you've got a more dramatic effect, but the same principle, where you've kind of used the stamp tool to texturize the image. And I said I was going to talk a bit about vignettes towards the end, and here you've got a nice image using that technique we were talking about with the snow hare. But you need really a bit of a vignette to focus the eye. So this has got a very subtle vignette done in Photoshop, very easy. You just get the marquee tool, feather it to about between 200 and 500 pixels, and then run it around, invert it, and then darken it down, however means you want to darken it down. I use levels, and then just basically through a layer, just adjust it to you. It's just right for you. If you want to go to the next level, and this is what I was talking about with nick dark and light center. Here, this plug-in filter just gives you a bit more control. So you actually put the cross on the eye and then adjust it round so that all the light is being focused onto the eye of the animal or the person or whatever else you want to use in it. Using textures, though, can overcome a whole manner of particular problems, particularly things like bland skies or trying to pull two parts of the image together. So here the texture has been rubbed out over the horses, but it's been applied to a very bland sky and naturally a very bland area of water as well. And here this is just where grain has been added post-production to give a texture to this low-key image, just to make it a little bit different. Putting your subject into a background has become quite popular and has done very well in terms of judging marks. So the guy was taken in a studio and then cut out and then put into this suitable background of a hall type environment, which lends itself more. This is called Last Rites, and a studio portrait again, and then cut out and put into a condemned cell in the crumbling jail. And again, it's been a successful image because it tells a story. And finally, the No Trespassers, the North York Moors, the heather being burnt off, and the image called No Trespassers with the guy, a suitably looking gamekeeper-ish. This image, probably one of my most successful images. Again, the girl was taken in a studio and then just put into the crypt, Fountains Abbey, and it just kind of helps the storytelling, giving that medieval effect. And this is called the Mad Commuter. I took the picture of the empty underground train in London on a Sunday when there was no one about, kept it for a couple of years, and it wasn't until I sort of took this image that thought, yeah, I think this will be where it's going to go, and it has done very well as a result. And the same sort of principle really, but this way the lighting has been taken from a very low angle to create that sort of sinister feeling, and then the seedy subway just finishes it off. So, post-production and a bit about Photoshop. So you may by now be thinking, oh well, you know, I have to really get into this creative side of things and do a lot of work in Photoshop. But I don't think that's necessarily the case. Yeah, you can buy the books and magazines and you can watch the YouTube videos and you can become very, very, very proficient at it. But the only message I really want to leave you with is don't confuse all that stuff with good post-processing of raw images. That's really what you want to master if you haven't already done so for impact. Make the difference between a mediocre image and one that stands out. If you want to obviously carry on and do creative images, then there's a huge place for them, and I'm sure they will continue to be successful. But we are photographers and not graphic designers, and if we can get it right in camera, so much the better. But just to make the point, as I made earlier, these two versions are the same image. Now, the one on the left has already had the raw conversion and post-processing, and the one on the right has had a lot more work done it. Now, the one on the left got me, was in my MPAGB panel. The one on the right was in my masters, and that's the difference. If you can see that, is where you have to get to if you want to get the higher marks. A final check of your image. Now, some of you, I'm sure you've all heard of Joe Cornish. Some of you may even know Joe Cornish. But Joe Cornish maintains that before he signs off an image, finally, he always looks at it upside down and he spots things that he couldn't see the right way up. Now, I'm not giving you this piece of advice to rush off and do that with all your images. I'm merely offering it to you as advice from the eminent Joe Cornish. So what makes a successful picture? Well, sometimes it really can be just how you processed it. So the one on the left-hand side has had positive clarity in the processing in Lightroom. Never did anything. The one on the right-hand side, sorry, the one on the left is that positive. One, you know what I mean. The one on the right, it's getting late, isn't it? The one on the right has had negative clarity. It's given it a much softer feel, and it's been so much more successful. If you want to set yourself up as to successful in printing, then I'm sure you all now know, this is a plug for the Masters of Print. Here, there's only 60 images accepted, and you can put up to, I think it's up to about 5 images in, but you will only get 1 accepted anyway, so it just widens your ability. But it's quite a good test of both your taking and your printing skills, and I was lucky enough to get mine in. So what does make a good picture? Well, there's all these words of advice, and in fact, if you go onto Google, there are 200 million views on how to make a good picture. But I don't think we'll spend all evening going through those. I think there's just one thing that actually, if you build that into your picture, it will guarantee you having a really strong image which will do well. That's all you've got to do. If you can get the wow factor into your images, that will actually help no end. A picture will always be successful, and sometimes it will have a wow factor if it works for you, and if it gives you what you set out to achieve. But once you put it into a competition, it's going to be judged against judging standards, certain criteria, and other people's work. And then you have to try and ensure that it meets all the competition standards. And that's when you have to raise your game. So let's just summarize all this. So it's good to know what judges are looking for, but take pictures for you. Don't give judges an easy time to find fault with your images. Looking for that wow factor in your photography. The more you try, the better you become at seeing it. And finally, be prepared to take good, constructive criticism and build on it, and just ignore all the rest. But hope this as talk has at least avoided you getting rejection, which is what we really don't want. But carry on enjoying your photography. Thanks for watching.